welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of the Nonprofit Show. Really excited to welcome back our one of our really interesting guests, Kirsten Wantland. Kirsten, welcome back to the Nonprofit Show. We're excited to have you with us.
Thanks so much. It's always great to be here.
I love chatting with you because you always bring us a really interesting perspective on things that maybe we can kind of sense, but we don't know or we need more education in. And so today we're going to be talking about mid and major donors. And I love that you added that word magical. And so that is how we're going to frame this whole thing is that don't be afraid, be excited about the magic that these types of donors can bring to our organizations. One of the magical things we have on the Nonprofit Show is definitely the buy-in and support of our sponsors. One of them, in one of our very first ones, is Bloomerang. We also have American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, and I just want to briefly mention that we have launched the Nonprofit Show Global Edition, where we are taking 1 to 2 episodes a month and just focusing on international philanthropy. So if you are an organization that's ever thought about expanding into the international, world of nonprofit or NGO work, this is going to be a show for you. It is co-hosted by Matthew Murray. He's based in the United Kingdom, and really interesting content that I think is just so important to be having those discussions. So Kirsten Wantland, okay, let's go on the time machine. When we first met you, you were working with Bloomerang customers, and I want to use the word training or just
Yeah.
integrating people, but now you've moved into a different part, which I find pretty dang interesting. It's intimidating.
It
So
is. Yeah, it's a very interesting trajectory. So I began my career at Bloomerang over 5 years ago, and I've had a lot of different roles. So I've worked in the support team. So when you chat in, you could have got me there. But then I spent the majority of my time at Bloomerang on the coaching and consulting team, essentially helping our organizations become more sustainable fundraisers. And that means learning different things throughout the system so that way we can leverage it. We can maximize kind of automations. You can turn some of the data that exists into your CRM into actionable insights. And then a lot of it was best practice on stored stuff, compliance stuff. So just helping our organizations being more efficient. And where I kind of live now in Bloomerang is actually on the engineering team. So I help the engineering team have a bit more context and make sure that we are building things that are actually going to be impactful for fundraisers. So it's been a very interesting transition, and I love it because we can really maximize a lot of this great information that I was only able to really get out on a one-to-one scale before. So now we're able to I'm able to work on really exciting things and just make sure that they're going to actually be the catalyst for a lot of change for a lot of our customers. So it's been a very exciting transition.
So I guess what I love about this with you is I feel like you've been in the trenches. You are a CFRE and CNC and CDE. You've lived this path and you've walked this journey. And now you can take that experience and kind of mind meld it to the technicians, which sometimes, the technicians are great at doing what they do and the programming and the structuring.
Yeah.
But if they haven't been in that journey of actually doing that fundraising work, it can be a little bit of a disconnect, right?
Yeah, and I think the domain expertise is where this also comes into play, right? Having a lot of that firsthand conversation and experience with our customers, and then translating that into how the product actually functions is so valuable. There's so much to learn about the space, the nonprofit space in general. So when we translate that into the software that our fundraisers are using every single day, it just really makes a perfect pairing that can help you exceed your missions. Because ultimately, as fundraisers, it can be frustrating when the tools that we have don't kind of work the way that we need them to. So the more that we learn and bring that expertise into the product, then the better off our fundraisers will be.
Yeah, that's super cool. I love that. And I think that that makes me even more excited to be talking about this this mid-level donor. So let's dig into it, because why should we be worrying about the mid to major donor, and why are those gifts so important now?
Yeah. So if you read the Giving USA trends, and if you don't read them, I think everybody should read them whenever a new edition comes out. So
Yeah.
this is a pretty regular pattern now that Giving USA has highlighted. A lot of the major gifts are coming from less and less donors. So it's not that generosity is decreasing because we see all the numbers are going up, right? We're still raising more, and those overall trends, they're just coming from less donors. So it seems like maybe the pipeline is narrowing. So this is where we have to start really paying attention to those, if we aren't already, to learn how to build that pipeline back up and build a sustainable channel. So that way we can really exceed our missions as fundraisers by helping them stay involved in our organization. So we should care now more than ever because of that trend.
Yeah, I love the way you just articulated that, because I think that if you went out and you just queried, 100 different nonprofit leaders in the C-suite, from fundraisers all the way through to CEOs, I don't know if they would understand that,
Yeah.
right?
And I
There's just, it's
I think
hard.
in theory, there's a lot of like, oh, we always care about major gift fundraisers or major donors, et cetera. But sometimes there's like a tactical lack of knowledge to say, like, what are the
Mhm.
signals? What are the patterns I should be looking for? Why should I be prioritizing them? How much time
Mhm.
should I be putting towards them? What should I be tracking for them that make a lot of that data more visible? So lots of good stuff to discuss around it.
I love that. And so that like moves us into the next thing that I want to ask you about. And that's the relationship management part of this.
Mhm.
And you're saying that there's a problem and we need to talk about it. What is that problem that you and your team have identified?
Yeah, so the problem really leads into lack of ownership or lack of visibility for that ownership, right? So there's sometimes
Oh,
there can be
interesting.
a conflict of who owns this relationship versus who manages the database versus who the founder and maybe C-level folks are in the organization that have all these personal ties. And really the problem comes down to visibility. So a lot of times when your CRM doesn't have like a native place to track that, it's like, oh, okay, well, we just have this institutional and inherited knowledge that Julia's relationship belongs to Kirst, but there's nothing that says that in the system. And
Right.
so it's hard to identify some of those patterns. So that's where we start seeing things tracked in spreadsheets outside of the system or a conglomerate of different things, or we're simply missing that data in our CRM, which leads to a very big gap of information. So, different areas in CRMs, like let's say a relationship manager or even reporting to show you what interactions will exist for someone, creating moves management plans that kind of show that ownership. That's where we need to rely a lot more on those tools that exist in our systems. So that way we have that visibility org wide and we know who owns that relationship.
So let me ask you this kind of follow-up question. Does this really fit into the conversation of portfolio management and portfolio structures? Because I'm amazed. I feel like I come across a lot of nonprofits that are having this problem that you're addressing because they don't use a portfolio system. And for those of you who are wondering what that is,
Mhm.
I think of it as an inventory. Like assigned a donor to a specific person, and everybody knows that that's their charge.
Yeah, and
So
I do think that ties into it, and it makes a lot of sense. This is one of those questions I get from organizations a lot that are like, "Well, but how do I start, right? How do I know who owns
yeah.
what?" And a lot of times, if you're in the early part of this, creating like a major donor giving program, a lot of the beginning of that is ownership and based on relationships. So, like Julia, if I knew you first, and then I'm then I'm starting this new program, maybe you'd be in my portfolio, right?
Mhm.
But what I encourage you to do is think strategically, not just personal relationships, but think about what characteristics, what giving patterns, what the end goal is. Because let's say I'm a
Mm.
major gift cultivator, I may want to work with folks who have a higher propensity or higher generosity ratings, or I know that they have demonstrated gift history and they really care about our organization. Sometimes that can be relationship intros, like
Mhm.
Julia will intro me to some of her friends who are also looking to support the cause.
Mhm.
But getting out of that, like, oh, it has to be a personal relationship
Interesting.
mindset can be very strategic, because this portfolio ownership doesn't only have to live within major donors, it can also live within mid-level donors, which will eventually become your major level donors.
Mhm.
Again, think of that pipeline attribution. And even things like recurring. I've spoken before about my soft spot for recurring donors, but that's the
Mhm.
kind of way you can manage a portfolio, is saying, well, Kirst really loves recurring donors. She's great at identifying those signals and converting folks to that kind of giving. So we're going to put her in charge of the recurring donor portfolio.
It's absolutely fascinating that you explain it that way because, intuitively, I think of it as like personality based and
Mm-hmm.
relationship. Like who have you had coffee with? If you want to break
Yeah,
it down, the most basic thing. So I really like this. You've challenged me a little bit on this, and I'm going to have to think about that
I think
because
it'll be a bigger pond for you to fish
yeah,
from, right? When you start
yeah,
looking at the characteristics and not just the relationships.
yeah, I think it's really a great. I have never heard anyone define that in this way. I love that you said this. Okay, so then let's expand on that even more because if we're looking at this, um, and there's ego involved
Mm-hmm.
with a development team,
Yeah,
and they're trying to define that mid to major donor, and then maybe somebody's going to have to give it up,
yeah,
like, I'm gonna have to relinquish, "Yeah, but I really like taking Mrs. Smith to coffee every quarter
mhm,
and sharing what I'm doing."
yeah,
I have to give her up to,
yeah.
so are we even figuring this out correctly?
I feel like this can be like team related, right? So if I've got a major donor or like a mid level and I'm like really comfortable with that one, sometimes the donor's preference of that relationship can have a strong impact on who owns it, right? And this
Right.
will vary from team to team. But one thing I encourage fundraisers to do is to take themselves out of the equation, because
Mhm.
it's not my and Julia's relationship that gets me here, right? It's our shared knowledge and passion for nonprofit education. So ultimately, what I encourage fundraisers to do is take themselves out of the equation in those. And this is very helpful for like also transitional shifts. I remember I was at a San Antonio conference. I was at Raise in 2025. And I had an audience member ask me a question. And she was like, I've been cultivating fundraising for this organization for 60 years. I want to step away. I want to retire. What do I do with my donor conversations? And I encouraged her, I'm
Mhm.
like, remove yourself from the conversation, and remind them why they give their
Yeah.
time, their money, their care for that organization, because ultimately that's what the support is. So if we want that support to outlast the relationship, which ultimately you do, as a fundraiser, your job is to help that donor marry the cause and maybe the outcome of the organization, rather than having them really enjoy your company. Like, of course, we want that to happen as well, but it's not the primary goal, it's secondary.
Yeah, it's a great way to look at it. And again, if you are starting out or trying to refine, that's a safe place to
Yeah.
start, right? Because it kind of, as we were saying, takes the ego out. Second part of this is that, everybody is going to have a different budget. Everybody's going to have different revenue metrics. How do we actually look at those mid-level donors? I mean, are they just smack dab in the middle, or do we create an artificial dollar amount that
Mm-hmm.
says you're 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, whatever? Like,
Sure.
what do you advise us on that?
Yeah, every organization is going to be a little different, right? So
Yeah.
this is one of those where I say, analyze your data, your organization, current giving patterns, maybe giving patterns within the last 5 years, and see what
Okay.
is actually normal versus what is assumed as a fundraiser, right?
Okay.
I might say, oh, my assumption for a major gift is $25,000, but how
Mhm.
many of those donors that I consider a major donor actually give within that threshold? So really part of this data analysis is taking yourself and your bias and your assumptions out of the equation and looking at what actual giving patterns are. Now, there are great resources in this sector, again, like Giving USA, the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, FEP,
Mhm.
right? They categorize donors into a bunch of different sections, and maybe you try and compare yours against that to see where your numbers land. And again, like thinking of that domino mindset or the portfolio
Mhm.
mindset that we want to cultivate, what does that size look like, right? And how does that distribute against your team members for who's going to own those relationships? So looking at it,
Mm.
I suppose that wasn't a super direct answer, but
No, it's
giving you ways to figure that out for your organization in a way that's authentic. And I'm not just telling you, oh, this is what a major donor means.
mhm. Well, I like what you said because I hadn't thought I was thinking of this strictly as line up the column of all the
Mm-hmm.
donations and go to the middle, go to
Yeah.
the statistical mean. I really like what you said about going back out into the marketplace and understanding what other organizations are doing, because if you do a better job, you're going to be raising those numbers, right? And
Yeah.
so it's going to be kind of a sway
Yeah.
in how we think about this. So start out maybe at a different level and make it somewhat, I'm going to dare I say, aspirational.
Yeah. And then we also see this deviate with like larger organizations, right? Larger
Mhm.
organizations will tend to have higher limits to those things.
Yeah.
Organizations that are more community based, et cetera, they're going to be on that smaller scale or have those smaller kind of dividers. But again, it's interesting to understand. And I would encourage looking at the industry sources like Fundraising Effectiveness Project, for example, because some of their micro level donors are considered under $100 a year, right? How many of those donors do you have? There's specific trends that happen with that subsegment of donors. So are your donors following that trend or are they exceeding it? It's just an interesting way to kind of compare what fundraising is happening at your organization to like what's going on data wise in
Yeah.
in the sector.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think that's really smart. And to me, you're a better steward and leader of your organization if you can go back to your board and everybody and disclose that type of information because
Mm-hmm.
that analysis will help you inform you on a lot of other decisions, right?
Oh,
I
exactly.
mean,
Yeah.
it's really healthy. So let's talk about this, maybe move into the data points
Mm-hmm.
and connecting the dots. I feel like this is like one of those things. Is it something that we do every day? It's a mindset shift. Is it just once a year? Like, how do we begin to lean into data and really navigating it through the way we work?
Yeah, this is a question I think I've dedicated my career to answering. So fundraising is beautiful, right? Because it is a marrying of relationships, it's a marrying of data science, it's a marrying of psychology, and then the very technical skills of like everything else you need in there, right? So it's kind of a marrying, a triad of all of those things. And so when like I think a lot of assumptions about fundraising is that it's all relationship based. If people care about the cause, they're going to give money to the cause, right? But there's actually a lot of data science behind it to understand like what the catalysts are. And like let's say, Julia, if I start cultivating you for a major gift today, what are the proper interactions that I should be having with you to convince you to give to my cause, right? So think of a lot of that as following in dominoes, right? And or dots, right? We're connecting those dots. What are the things that need to happen that make that effort successful? And we can gain a lot of that clarity by looking at patterns that have worked before in the system. Now, part of the mystery of fundraising so far in my career has been like, man, what is the secret sauce? What is the algorithm that like gives me 100% success rate, right? I don't know that there's a secret algorithm really per se, but like every organization is going to find out what works for them, but you only do that when you analyze patterns. So this is something where I say, one, make sure you have a strategic plan, because the majority of organizations, maybe they write their strategic plan a year or two prior, or maybe they do like a 5-year plan. And then when something goes wrong in the plan or is off on the plan, they don't change that plan. They're just like, oh, okay, well, it's off, right? And maybe we'll try again, or we'll plan it differently next year. But this is where I say the plan is great for guidance and for intention, but don't be afraid to deviate from that plan to make adjustments that are necessary. So as often as you can do that, and really you only know what adjustments to make when you're looking at the data, and you're looking at the data frequently, and you're using the data to make the plans. So this is something where I say, don't just do a quarterly review or a biannual review, or maybe when you're running your annual report, it's the first time you look at effectiveness. I want you to be doing that as often as you have capacity. And this is just as important as taking that scheduling time to meet with major donors, to write grants, etc. Because what you understand about your fundraising landscape on a large scale is really going to help you be successful. And again, success for you means funding your mission. So that is where we really have to understand you only get the answers from the data. So we have to be working with it very regularly.
Yeah, and I would add, you have to be courageous.
Yeah.
You have to be able to sit with yourself and what you learn and find, as opposed to being positive. I don't want to say being positive, because I don't.
No, I get that. I understand that, because
yeah.
I think of myself really in my fundraising world as an optimist, right? Because like I really want to believe that what I try to do, because I'm trying to do it for good, is going to be successful. That's not always the case. Maybe an appeal falls flat. Maybe you don't raise enough for a campaign, right? We have to understand the root cause of those things in order to plan for them differently next time, or to even change that outcome while there's still time, right? So if you're running a campaign, don't wait until 2 days before the campaign ends to be like, oh my gosh, we still need $80,000, right? So start tracking those milestones and kind of analyzing and looking at those patterns, success rates, etc., while you're still in the thick of that work, so you can make some changes when you realize something's not going to plan.
Right. And I love that you brought that up, because I think if you have that mindset, you can still be an optimist, but you can be a realist in the same, say like, hey, things might not work, but let's not let them fail.
Right, exactly.
Step in or understand why they failed. Maybe that's even better.
Yeah.
So this has been a fascinating conversation. And in the time that we have left, I really want to get like that bigger picture. Like, what's the umbrella that we should be under when it comes to this knowledge and the magic of the mid to the major level donors? Because you've thrown a lot of really interesting pieces at us, so much that I can see where we could pick a few things and navigate those and then move on to the next. But what is that overall thing that we should be looking at?
Yeah, it's really understanding your donors, right?
Okay.
And if I had to say it in one sentence, it's understanding your donors. That could mean a lot of different things. Yes, it's understanding their motivations from like a psychological perspective, but it's also about understanding what those catalysts are, right? How do those people that end up becoming mid and major donors, how do they come to your organization in the first place, right? Is that a pipeline we can build? Or for donors that are mid donors, how do they become major donors? What are the relationship touches that move them from mid to major? What are the causes that they're contributing for? Is it annual funds or is it program specific, right? So really, I encourage the audience here to look at a lot of those successful relationships and say, is this something we can standardize to make sure that we can maximize the folks that are coming in here? And when we say standardize, we mean things like creating moves management plans. So if Julia, if you've got 3 friends that are kind of in your same giving profile, etc., can I test that plan, or can I test what I did with you to see if that is successful with them? And then you make adjustments, right? So it's a constant cycle of iteration where you're saying, is this working? Is this going? No, it's not working. Awesome. Let me pivot and let me try that again. So it's kind of like a flywheel, right? Where you are just constantly doing little minor tweaks to see what's going to be most effective for your organization. And again, you can start anywhere with this. And this is where relying on your data is going to be really important. The more you're tracking what you're doing, the more visibility you have into what's going to work.
Right. It's fascinating to think about this, because for so long we have been taught, I think, in the fundraising part of the nonprofit sector, just to like stay the course, keep hammering, and not step back. And I almost want to use the word breathe, right? Don't,
Yeah.
don't, it's not like, don't think, do.
Yeah.
Do you sense that this is like a changing time with the way we look at the profession of fundraising?
Yeah. Quality and quantity, right?
Yeah.
I think there used to be a lot of, I want to say like success metrics or a perception of success if a
Yep.
certain number of metrics have happened. Like
Right.
even today, I still see donors and major gift relationship managers saying, I want to know how many touches this person had with this person
Yep.
of this particular kind, right? The touches are fine, and that's good data to consider, but it is not the most important piece of data. And it's oftentimes not the most important piece of the relationship, right? We have to understand what the qualitative benefit is. What is the quality of that relationship, the quality of that source coming in? So it's a difference of that qualitative versus quantitative stuff. Oftentimes it'd be like, well, if we just put out 5,000 mailers, we're going to get this percent back. Maybe that's what we need. But it's different. We're teaching fundraisers now to do things more strategically. So that way your ROI is higher and you're wasting less money. You're having more intentional conversations with donors. So it's a lot of that all wrapped up in once. But that is something I do encourage, is like, if you don't understand your own fundraising landscape, if you don't take that time to pause, you really can't get more efficient, because you're just doing the same thing of pushing number of experiences out there. And that's not the way that we're seeing a lot of change in the sector today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that you said that, because for so long, I mean, I would say throughout my career as a non-paid, non professional fundraisers, community fundraiser, it's always been a numbers game. I mean, we've always had that mentality that you just got to keep cranking it,
Sure.
because the more you push out, the more you get in.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this concept of being more mindful, being more strategic, more thoughtful,
Mm-hmm.
so that it's not just a numbers game, because that's not sustainable.
No, and let's say we're doing that mailing example I just talked about, right? A direct
Mhm.
mail campaign of like 5,000. Let's say you get 120 back.
Right.
What would change if you cultivated those 120 different donor relationships more intentionally over the next year, right? And you mailed a much smaller subset. So what would
Right.
change if you brought a lot of those donors who are kind of at arm's length a little bit closer to the organization and started filling some of those pipelines based on their propensity and what they care about and all of their other beautiful data points, right? So it's more about strategic cultivation of those relationships rather than quantity.
Right. Oh my gosh, Kirsten Wantland. Every time you're on the nonprofit show, I get like all jazzed up. I get a new perspective that's very achievable, that is intellectual, and not just I don't know, it just frees me up from that grind mentality, if you will, right? And so super cool to welcome you back onto the nonprofit show. Kirsten Wantland, she is a principal industry strategist, as you could figure out from our conversation. She's very strategic and a deep thinker. And she's with our friends over at Bloomerang. And so love having your voice in our sector. It's so cool to hear from somebody who's done the work and then is navigating through this new ecosystem. Really fun. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I love being here, and kind of hopefully some of this knowledge encourages our audience members to be a little bit more strategic in this work.
Yeah, rethink the way we're doing things. And that's, I think, the magic. And that's in the title of the show today. That is magical thinking. It really is. Well, we have magical thinking because of our friends over at Bloomerang, along with the American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that are with us day in and day out. Kirsten, we are coming close to our 1,600th episode.
Yay.
And you've been a part of our journey. So I do want to say thank you for always coming on and sharing with us amazing things that we can all, no matter the size of our organization, we can lean into. And that's really, really exciting. As we end the nonprofit show, we end with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.